Welcome to the Old Loomis channel again. This is the, I think probably this, I have to say probably the second installment of the modifications for an HD2010 flashlight. I'm going to work on a tail cap today, and I'll talk a little bit about the tools that I use. I'm going to do the copper braid mod to the tail cap spring. So I have a soldering gun, and I used to have a a really nice outfit, but it sort of went poof on me one day. I don't have no idea why, but anyways, this is a very inexpensive soldering unit. You can buy them off a lot of places. I got mine off of Amazon. It was like 22 bucks for the soldering unit. Then I also have a jar of rosin here, and I don't, it didn't take very long before the lid stuck to the container, so I just cut a slot out here where I could push it down and get some of the rosin out, and then lay it right up in the top. What I use for a brush is I use a paintbrush. This is one of those, paint by number paint brushes, and I've cut it off a little bit, and I just use that for applying the rosin. Just put a little on there, and that's how I do that. Then I have the Radio Shack. This is 032 6040 rosin core solder, and then I have some desoldering braid. Then I'm going to go ahead and look over at the other side over here to the actual tail cap and see what stuff I'm using there. Okay, well, I have the tail cap. Of course, the tail cap has been all stripped down. I have the tail cap itself, the switch and spring assembly, the little brass cap that goes over top of the spring, a couple of different bushings in here, and I've got everything that, the switch button itself. So I've got everything there, and then I have a pair of needle nose, a pair of clippers for cutting the copper braid, and some 4/0 steel wool. All of these threads in these lights, and I do this with a lot of the lights, especially the ones that do not have square cut threads, or the ones that are a little less expensive light. The threads just are a little bit rough. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll take 4/0 steel wool and just lightly go through and work those threads with the 4/0 steel wool. Not a lot, but just enough to where you can see that they look more polished, but they're also smoother. It takes those little rough pieces that are on there from the when they do the initial thread cutting, and they haven't, they don't have them smoothed off. I'll just go through and I'll rub them all down, and it helps to take off the roughness in them, and it makes the threads a lot easier to work. Same thing on the inside of the tail cap. I'll go in there and do that. So I'm going to finish doing that, and we'll come back again. Okay, so I've like I said, I've used the 4/0 steel wool to clean all of the threads, even down inside and here. You can see it, if you can, well, when you do it yourself, you notice, but it's a lot more polished, and basically it's removed the oxide layer that's going to, come on anything that's bare aluminum. So it helps to give a better contact too when you put it all together. All right. Then I'm going to go ahead and start working on just putting the copper braid into the spring. One of the first things I'm going to do with this spring is I'm going to redo the original soldering where the spring is soldered to the board. It's just touched with a little bit of solder, and I don't care for that. I like to really have quite a bit in there to try to make sure that we have the best contact and the least resistance. So, excuse me, I'll put this up into my vise here, hold it in place, and then I'm going to do a little solder work on that spring. I sort of do it the quick and easy way when I clean a soldering gun. I just take and use a paper towel and clean my residue off my tip, and I'll get a little bit of flux here, and I'm going to put some down inside that spring area where I'm going to solder to, and I'll probably put it all around in there. Then I'll get a little. Well, this is interesting to try to do this with a video, and I don't even think twice about stuff when I do it. You know, I'm going to go ahead and get some solder onto the tip of the soldering gun, and then I'm going to start working the solder onto that area and just holding it down until it flows by itself. Okay, and it goes pretty easy, doesn't take too long. Once you have flux on something like that, it spreads that solder out pretty fast. Okay. So now we have a little bit better solder joint for that spring, and I'm going to take my little piece of copper braid, and I just bend the end of that copper braid, okay, at a 90, and I put it down in the spring and set it down so that the 90 is down flush against the bottom. And then I'm going to take my soldering gun again, and I'm not going to worry too much about flux because that was already fluxed, and I'm going to get some more solder on that thing and see if I can't work that on there. So I'm going to go right through the spring and reach down inside and touch that copper braid and the base of the spring. Oh, that gets hot, yeah. And hopefully made a pretty good contact there for that copper braid. All right. Then I'm gonna scrunch down that braid so it has some folds in it. Okay, so it has a little play in it, and at the very top, I've left just a little bit of braid on the very top where I can hook to solder it to the top of the spring. You know, most springs at the top have a 90 across them where they form the tip, and I'll take a little bit more flux. Eep, that's a lot more flux, and I'll put that on that spring, and of course it'll go to the braid really quickly. Then I go ahead and let's see if I need to clean that tip a little again. All right, and then I'll go ahead and put some solder on that and get it on the spring, and try to get some solder onto the spring itself and onto the braid, and hopefully I can put the two of them together. Okay. All right, so we'll say that looks like it's probably all right. Should still have spring action. Okay. Should still have some spring action in it, and it's soldered together. The next thing is that I have to, in fact, I'm going to move over to the other side of the table here where I can put the rest of the assembly together. Shut off my soldering gun, so hold on a second. Okay, so now I'm back at where the assembly area is for the disassembled pieces. I have the switch that's and spring assembly that's been done. I have the brass cap that goes over top of that spring and the bushing that goes on too. So the brass cap goes inside that bushing. All right. Then the spring goes in. Now this spring is in very tight, I've noticed. And so I've got to do some work here to get that spring, or that brass cap down on that spring. And I need to get it down in quite a ways if I can. So I'm just trying to twist that into position. It hasn't gone in where I'd like it to be. There we go. Okay, so I just pushed on it. So now the brass cap is on there pretty good and strong, and that assembly is ready. I'll go ahead and put the button back into the tail cap. Just lay it down in there and take a finger and pop it in place. Okay. Then we have this plastic piece that actually holds the switch and keeps the switch from turning as it's in place, and it keeps it centered. Okay, so it's at the center of the button. That piece goes in as well, and that goes in, there you go, you can see it, and down in above the button. Then our switch assembly is going to go in, and that goes down in until it fits down into that plastic piece down at the bottom. Then we're going to take our bushing, and it's going to screw in over top of all that. Okay, and so hang on just a second here. Okay, I went and got a pick. I didn't show that as the tools, but there's a little bit of spring pressure in here, and it might be a little hard to get this thing started, so I'm going to try using, possibly try using a pick and my fingers to get this started. Okay, like that. So I've gotten it started now, and I can just turn it down, and then when it starts getting tight, I can go ahead and use my needle nose and hold with the needle nose and turn the tail cap and tighten everything down until it tightens down real snug. Okay, and I just really snug it up as well as I can, and then I got to check for, make sure that the spring is still working, the plunger action works. Okay, and one last thing, let me grab my meter and we'll check. Okay, just to make sure that everything is working and the switch is working the way it is, I'll check from the outside of the aluminum tail cap to the center, and I have no continuity, so then I'll activate the switch, and then we should have continuity if everything's working. It should go to 0. There you go. Okay, so we know that the switch is working, and that's it for the tail cap mod. Now, I didn't bother, tearing the switch down or anything like that. I'm really not going to worry about doing something like that for what we're doing. This is a stock clicky switch that you see in most of these Chinese lights. They rate them at like 1.5 amps. These things will take up to 8 amps, 10 amps. So I'm not worried about overamping it. Okay, and the copper braid down inside the spring helps to reduce resistance, therefore it helps to keep from getting so much heat into the spring that the spring will die and lose its springiness from excess heat. So that's our tail cap mod. It's pretty simple. It doesn't take a lot of time to do, and it really helps to cut resistance. All right, well, thanks for watching. Okay, there's probably two things I did not state. And number one is that brass plunger, I also buffed it up with steel wool to get any residue off that plunger. The second thing is the flux that I use is rosin flux. Since I'm using a rosin core solder, I'm using a rosin flux. Now you could use solid solder without, not using a rosin core. The only reason I use rosin core solder is because sometimes I don't actually flux ahead of time, and I rely on the rosin in the solder to help flow the solder. So anyways, I just thought I ought to point those out too. Thanks.